So as you may or may not know, Trump, Rubio, and Elon Musk has successfully dismantled the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, or USAID. USAID for many years has been the development arm of the United States government. There are three D's, we used to say, in foreign policy: diplomacy, which is the State Department; defense, which is our military; and development, which was USAID. USAID was responsible for disaster relief, for supporting civil society, providing healthcare and humanitarian assistance in conflict zones after major disasters like earthquakes or tsunamis or floods, things like that. And millions of people around the world have been provided support because of USAID. And when you think about why do you engage in foreign policy, there's hard security and soft security, hard power, soft power. USAID is a big part of the U.S. government's soft power around the world, meaning that we get a lot of goodwill based on the support that USAID had been providing to people in many countries around the world, because they see bags of food or medicine or a road that's built or a bridge that's built, things like that. And there's these placards, there's stamped on the goods that are given, gifts from the U.S. government, things like that, and the USAID and the U.S. flag right there. But for some reason, despite the fact that Rubio for many years and others in the Republican Party have supported USAID and spoken about how important USAID was, went with Trump and Musk to go down this path of dismantling the agency entirely, firing thousands of employees around the world and here in Washington, D.C., and trying to move some of those programs under the State Department, which is just, it's not realistic to be able to do all that under the State Department. That's part of the goal, right? These folks within the Republican Party don't really want to do the work that USAID was doing. They just want to spend $1 trillion on the military. And frankly, the military can't do everything around the world, and nor should it, nor do we want it to. And what USAID was able to do was build partnerships, build civil society, work with emerging democracies, support governments that are doing, trying to do better. And now all that's gone. But what I want to talk about today is some of the messaging that is coming through, from especially Secretary of State Marco Rubio, because on July 1st, he posted this on a Substack of all places, basically a note about why they were dismantling USAID and what's going to happen in the future. And the cognitive dissonance and really the worldview here is just really worth unpacking, because clearly these are not people that understand the world and can effectively, with critical thinking skills, look at our history. So I just want to look at this letter together and kind of talk a little bit about it. So here you have this making foreign aid great again, play on making America great again, which apparently everything needs to fit into these nice little catchphrases for Trump. But you have Secretary of State Marco Rubio issuing this here, basically talking about how every public servant has an obligation to American citizens, fund programs in the national interest. Mind you, Republicans, once Trump and Musk decided they wanted to get rid of USAID, were saying they were doing anti-American things, they were funding programs around the world. Congress is the one that gives money to these different agencies. So for years, these Republicans were voting on these budgets that were giving the funding to USAID to do these programs. If they wanted more oversight, they could have had it. They could have had a hearing. They could have called in USAID administrators or, USAID program support staff to talk about the programs that they were funding and then decide, hey, you know what, we're not going to fund this in the next budget. They didn't do any of that, pretty much ever. They had been supporting these programs and funding them. That's what Congress's role is. But facts don't matter, apparently. So USAID for decades had a near infinite taxpayer budget. That's not true. The budget for USAID pales in comparison to the budget that we give to the defense budget. We're talking about for state and aid combined. So all of our diplomacy programs, all of our development programs, all of our embassies around the world, all of the staff, all the support staff, all the programmatic funding and the support that we were giving, it was around $60 billion, give or take, for all of that. Meanwhile, the Defense Department has close to $1 trillion. So huge disparity there. What we're seeing here basically is this idea and this mindset that despite giving all this money to all these places around the world, there's still development objectives have rarely been met, instability is often worsened, and anti-American sentiment has only grown. Well, why is that? It's not because we're giving support around the world. It's because of the things that our military is doing around the world, right? So here you have on the global stage, countries that benefit the most from our generosity usually fail to reciprocate. Well, yeah, because we're giving support to countries that are struggling, right? We're not providing the support to people, in countries like the United Kingdom or France that can afford to reciprocate to some degree. You're giving support to countries that quite literally are failing to provide for their people. But okay. For example, in 2023, the sub-Saharan African nations voted with the United States only 29% of the time on essential resolutions at the UN, despite receiving $165 billion in outlays since 1991. Okay, well, a little strange to go back into 1991, but sure, they wanted like some kind of round number to be able to show. But also, what are essential resolutions, right? What are they talking about? More often than not, when the U.S. is trying to ensure a certain resolution, it's likely got to do with Israel. And many countries around the world have not found Israel's gross human rights violations in Gaza and the West Bank, even before the atrocities on October 7th and then the aftermath, thereafter in Gaza. Even before that, for many years, countries have been voting to try to ensure that there could be, equal rights and some, level of human rights and human dignity for Palestinians. And so the U.S. would often say like, oh, you're voting against our interests. Well, it really mostly comes down to Israel. But I digress. Over the same period, more than $89 billion invested in the Middle East and North Africa left the U.S. with lower favorable ratings than China and every nation but Morocco. Well, let's think about that. What has happened since 1991 till now that maybe some Middle Eastern countries would not be so fond of the U.S. for? I don't know. Various wars in the Gulf. You have the invasion of Iraq. You have the toppling of a democratically elected leader in Iran, which happened before 1991, but the after effects thereafter, massive. Invasion of Afghanistan, killing and slaughtering, direct and indirect violence leading to the deaths of millions of people. Torture, indefinite detention, extraordinary rendition. We were basically abducting people off the streets, putting them into prisons, torturing them, realizing that, oh, this isn't really the person that we want. And quite literally, a plane would drop down, kick them out, and then they'd take off, just drop them in the middle of nowhere. Guantanamo Bay, just having people indefinitely detained without any kind of rights at all. Us continuously bombing Yemen to no effect except for killing, innocent civilians and ensuring that, people would starve. Supporting proxy wars, supporting the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the UAE to bomb the crap out of Yemen. I can go on and on, but when you're trying to balance this here, it's like, yeah, well, we gave a few $1 million worth of assistance to this country. Why don't the people like us? Well, because you're bombing them, right? So on the one hand, you're trying to compare these two things. It's like it's worse than apples and oranges. It's like apples and Ford F-150s. Like they're not in the same realm, right? If you're going to continuously bomb, overthrow, destroy, kill people, displace people, not provide support, that's going to outweigh the little bit of money that we're giving to some emerging democracies or civil society organizations. The amount of chaos that the U.S. military has caused in the Middle East for decades, especially since the 90s till now, far outweigh, both in spend and in destruction, the supposed good that U.S.A.I.D was trying to do. So it's just a little weird and, quite frankly, ignorant and sad for the Secretary of State to try to articulate that they're totally confused as to why the Middle East, Middle Eastern countries may not have favorable viewpoints of the United States. Then you have here the agency's expenditure of $9.3 billion in Gaza and the West Bank since 1991. Again, I don't know why 1991. Whose beneficiaries included allies of Hamas have produced grievances rather than gratitudes towards the United States. Again, the funding and the support that the US government has given to programs, organizations, and even the governments within the West Bank and Gaza over the years are small fraction. $9.3 billion since 1991. We give that much money to Israel for military support every year, more than that every year, more than that since October 7th. And so it's not, as they are articulating here, this is produce more grievances than gratitude. No, it's not the aid that's producing the grievances. It's the support for a genocidal regime in Israel, the Netanyahu regime especially, to be basically with impunity bombing, attacking, destroying, creating a police state, ethnically cleansing, crimes against humanity, war crimes, torture, indefinite detention, racking up endless amounts of, young children that are being detained and imprisoned from the West Bank, ensuring that there is an apartheid state and helping prop up that apartheid state. That's why there's more grievances than gratitude. Again, like if you're investing hundreds of billions of dollars in the physical destruction of a group, the torture of the group, the blockade of the group, the incitement of violence, the attacks on these people, the indefinite detention, every kind of rights violation you can imagine. You're spending hundreds of billions of dollars propping up the Israeli regime that's doing that to them, knowing that the U.S. government is behind it, and then you're giving just like pennies and saying like, well, how come you're not grateful for this? It is absolutely crazy that this is the Secretary of State's mentality for this. But it's telling. It's telling that this is the worldview that Republicans have, where they don't understand that the impact of our military's budget and spend and the gross human rights violations that we support, either directly or indirectly, is what's causing the grievances amongst these people. It's not the humanitarian aid and support that we're giving. So it's a really weird and sad, frankly, place that we find ourselves in, because they don't get it. And I don't know how we can make them get it, but also how we can make sure that the average voter in America understand. Part of this is just the whitewashing of history and, not really understanding the role that the U.S. plays in the world. But we need to do better, because quite frankly, this is just embarrassing. So, what goes on here, there's like all this stuff here about how U.S.A.I.D views its constituencies as the United Nations, multinational NGOs, broader global community, not the U.S. taxpayers. Again, like utterly ridiculous. Once again, Congress was the one that appropriates the money for U.S.A.I.D. If members of Congress had a problem with how U.S.A.I.D was doing its work, they could have changed their budgets. They could have edited, the programs. They could have called hearings. They didn't do any of that. They just dismantled the agency. Promoted anti-American ideals and groups. Again, there's no basis for this. It's not clear what they're talking about. It's just throwaway words, that mean nothing. Global DEI, again, this war on DEI is just quite frankly absurd. It's like the new code for white supremacy, basically, which is being borne out in the DoD by, them taking down, the naming of different naval ships and bases and others for people that aren't just white men. Censorship, regime change operations. Again, like regime change operations, yeah, it's horrible that we do that, but we've done that through the CIA. It's not U.S.A.I.D that's doing that. And I'd be all on board if MAGA wants to decide that regime change operations we shouldn't be involved in. But many folks within MAGA and the Republican Party have been calling for regime change in Iran right now. So clearly, they're the ones who have been supporting these regime change operations for years. It had nothing to do with U.S.A.I.D and everything to do with the horrible, intelligence and military funding that we have. NGOs and international organizations in league with communist China and other, again, I don't know it's ridiculous what they're talking about here. But quite frankly, at the end of the day, it's just that we have a government right now where they're willing to blame everybody but themselves, not really willing to admit what the problem is, not willing to admit that the problem often is our foreign policy. And that's what needs to change. We need to build a more progressive foreign policy that's focusing on human security, human rights, conflict prevention, all these kinds of things. And we need to do that with a well-equipped State Department and USAID, or, however the case may be. But investing way more in diplomacy and development and supporting programs like that than our military, because we don't have a good track record with our military. And quite frankly, it's really frustrating that USAID and the State Department have been held to such a high standard to show the positive impact of its work. Meanwhile, the military, they bomb things left and right, spend, millions and billions of dollars, and have no success to report, but yet Congress doesn't care. And apparently the American people don't care. The amount of drone strikes and things like that that we've been, attacking various places around the world, spending millions and billions of dollars. We've been bombing Somalia and Yemen for decades, and it hasn't helped. So we spend how much money? Trillions of dollars in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what happened in Afghanistan? The Taliban came right back in. So we need a new approach to our foreign policy. And this, just is all window dressing. It's all BS. We need leaders that are going to do better, because this is not helping.